Hello and welcome to the Retail Science Podcast. I'm Jeff Gorey. This is a monthly podcast featuring the hidden secrets of top-tier retailers and how they apply AI and data science. The show features conversations with people who have been in the trenches for some of the biggest brands in retail. If you enjoy the content, please subscribe, rate, and review us to help us reach more people. Finally, we are brought to you by Retsy, Retail Science Simplified. Find us at retsci.com. I hope you enjoy this episode.
Great. Well, very excited to do another episode of the Retail Science Podcast. Q2 earnings calls have wrapped up. So this month we're going to have Meg Galgano, our head of business consulting, back, and we're going to talk about some of the things that were present or maybe not present in the earnings calls for Q2. So Meg, thanks for joining us.
Hi there. I'm always excited to talk about this stuff, so thanks for giving me the chance. I'll hop right in and I'll start with just a general overview of what the quarter looked like from a retail perspective.
Great.
So if you can see here overall, one of the things that was maybe less interesting, but interesting based off of last quarter, is that by month, the performance was pretty consistent. So yes, there's a spread, but it's nothing super crazy, nothing that makes us look at it and think there's something there. The reason I call this out is because last quarter, there was something different. The trend we saw was that in the middle of March, it dropped off significantly, and that corresponded with economic factors and the collapse of SVB Bank. So this is just something more similar than what we saw in Q1, which went from 7% to 5.9 to 2.6 across. So very different than what we're seeing here. The other thing, which is consistently inconsistent, is we see mixed results across retailers and across categories. So this is always a little the case. I'll talk more about these in depth a little bit later, but home improvement, department stores struggled. Department stores are interesting. I'm not going to talk about them later, so I'll give a little bit of context there. Department stores are mid-market for the most part, and that's one of the places that inflation is impacting the most. It is pushing people down to more value-based retailers, so department stores are certainly seeing that impact. Nordstrom, Macy's, Kohl's, JCPenney, all of those were down. Nordstrom and Macy's were down 0.5% or less. The other is much more significant. The only one who's the exception is Dillard's. So Dillard's had good performance. Also one of the only department stores that maintains a really intense focus on customer experience and merchandising and those things. So that's always interesting. For who's performing well, beauty, wellness, and luxury. So I'll talk about those. I'll talk about beauty and wellness a little bit more as we go forward, but luxury is really interesting here. So this continues to be performance that we're seeing outpace the other categories, and a lot of it is driven by international. So that's interesting for sure. When we look at the specific areas that we're seeing it, Hugo Boss raised their guidance. Louis Vuitton was, by region, looks different. US was down 1%, Europe was up 18%, and Asia was up 34%. And that encompasses most of the brands we think of when we think of luxury. So that's Louis Vuitton and Givenchy and Dior and Fendi and Celine, and they own many more as well. But that one, you see a very clear distinction from a geographic perspective as well. And then I'll always just slip Lululemon in here, which does a little bit of contradiction on some of the later categories that we'll talk about, but I'll say they're cuspy on if they're luxury, but we'll talk about it that way. They were up 18, and North America was up 11. Non-North America was up 52. So very significant. And within that non-North America, China had the highest comp at up 61. So we're seeing some interesting variation within those categories. And then the last just overview piece on here is consumer sentiment is improving. So there was a survey done by University of Michigan in August to evaluate consumer sentiment and how they were feeling. And it was up 22% to last year. So people are feeling good about it, but we're not seeing the exact same thing in their behavior translate. So it will be interesting to see if there are traffic trends that emerge, and if we start to see a pickup heading into the holiday season.
No, that all makes a lot of sense. What about, were there specific areas that really jumped out besides these kind of bigger trends?
Absolutely. Let's talk about some specifics. So we talked about this a bit last quarter as well, but from a different perspective, and that would be the year of normalization continues. So trends within categories and brands and consumer behavior continues to shift a bit back to where it was previously before the pandemic happened and the world flipped upside down. This goes back to where we were mentioning it previously, that beauty, dressy and formal apparel, services, and luxury are all having great performance across the board. So even at brands that were overall not seeing good performance, they're seeing some of these pick up. This is not super surprising when you look at what they are. So beauty, sorry, one second. So beauty, it dropped off significantly during COVID. People were buying less makeup, buying less hair care products and things like that. Makes sense that would pick back up. Dressy and formal, obviously. Things have still shifted a little bit more casual in general, but people are back in offices, people are going to weddings, people are having events.
Absolutely.
All of those things make sense, right? Services we'll talk about in a moment. Luxury we just talked about. Similar to what we were just speaking about, sleep and active are both generally down. Lululemon, of course, is the exception. But both of those categories are things that had huge spikes during COVID, huge. So it may not necessarily be a weakness in the business, but a pull forward of their demand. So they got huge spikes earlier over the last couple of years. Home furnishings and home improvement is another space where seeing significant underperformance, I'll call it now, but similarly, it was pulled up. So giant comps and huge spikes in their business during COVID, but just about everybody, Williams Sonoma, Lazy Boy, Container Store, all of those are seeing significantly lower than the average. Same thing with Home Depot, same thing with Lowe's. The only exceptions there are Lovesac and Home Goods within the TJX brand did great. So TJX overall did well, but they called out Home Goods specifically as doing really well. And then we mentioned Lowe's and Best Buy actually specifically called out a return to vendor-funded promotions. So this is a little different. This isn't specifically consumer behavior. This is industry behavior. And there was a shortage of inventory and an excess of demand. So you didn't need to do vendor-funded promotions because you had the demand and you didn't have the inventory to support it anyway. So now we're in a situation where both of those things have normalized in a little bit of a different way. So they both called out that we're seeing more of that. So as consumers, we can all benefit from that. And then just a little more context on the services piece. We'll jump down to the next bullet. Discretionary funds are going to travel and food and things like that versus actual items. So Delta raised their guidance, Marriott raised their guidance, Norwegian Cruise Lines, so that they're operating at 105% of their capacity. So overall, also not surprising. That's
well done. Yeah.
That's right. Harkens back to the normalization. This is, pent up demand still flowing through there. And then the next one is value focus. So off-price, value focused, calling it value focused, but dollar stores and outlet locations had great performance. At outlet locations, Macy's, Bloomingdale's, both on the Macy's call said that their outlet locations were doing really well, even though overall it didn't do great. Dick's called it out specifically. Off-price had great performance. Burlington, Ross, TJX all had good, strong performance there. And then value focused, Dollar Tree and Family Dollar. The one exception would be Dollar General. So it's a bit lower. They expected to be higher than this. So I realize it's relatively close to some of the others, but their expectation was higher. Their forecasts were higher than this. And they've noted a specific struggle with inventory and excess markdowns, and their overall margin impacts are going to be something that they'll need to tackle over the next couple of quarters. So I think it will be interesting to see how they handle that.
Yeah, well, I definitely know a group that could probably help them with those inventory markdown issues, but I'm sure they'll figure it out. One thing you haven't mentioned is inflation. Was there any chatter or anything in the earnings reports that hit on that topic?
any cheddar. I mean, I think it's like 45% of what gets talked about in there. But yes, perfect segue to my next slide, which is general economic factors and inflation. So overall, the economy continues to impact retail. That's always what impacts retail. That is what we consistently see. But there are a handful of specific things. So high interest rates will continue to impact all forms of retail. They have extra impact on things like home furnishings, home improvements, because people are buying less houses and there's less people moving into new houses and less people tackling giant renovations on houses that they buy, things like that. There's also a possibility of a reduction in WIC benefits. So that's a food program for low income women and children. It hasn't happened yet, but it did get called out on multiple calls that they are concerned about what the potential impact will be. So that's more people preparing for a change, and they think there is potentially already an impact, similar to the student loan repayment resumption. On here, I have noted specifically Macy's, Walmart, and Dick's, but man, lots of people called it out. So we're heading into that time frame now where the student loan payment will resume, and I think we probably will see an impact on our overall economy as a whole. One of the other ones that I thought was interesting in all the calls I listened to, it is uncommon to have them talk about their credit card revenue. And both Kohl's and Macy's called out bad debt as an impact to their profitability. So on their private label credit cards, people defaulting. Generally overall, right now, we're seeing the highest levels of credit card and car loan debt default in 10 years. So any retailers that have PLCC, they're going to have some impact to this. So I think they're going to have to adjust and make sure that their plans are accounting for this. And then another one is increased wages. So this is just something that everybody needs to keep in mind as they're thinking about their profitability. Kohl's, Target, Best Buy all called this out. There are a handful more as well. Target was kind of one of the pioneers on this. They started increasing their hourly worker wages well before COVID to remain competitive. So it's put pressure on other people. I actually recently was just listening to a Costco call, and they were stating that they've always had high pay, which is the case. I have a little bit of a fangirl attitude about Costco, so I know quite a lot about them, but they said on their last call that their average hourly worker, I think, makes around $26 an hour. So interesting.
Yeah.
Yes, definitely impacts their profitability. So just something to keep in mind. And then to your original question, inflation. It kind of feels, ridiculous to talk about inflation because it's all we talk about. So the reason I have it on here is not only is it something that is certainly an economic factor, but also June had the lowest inflation since March 2021, which is pretty great. I will take that for sure. But if we look at both July and August, it increased. So this isn't a concern yet, but if we're talking about it's been going down consistently for a year, and now we're going to start seeing it going back up again, it will be interesting to see if that has any impact on what happens going into our holiday season. So
We were so close.
we're so close, but now we have inflation going up, we have WIC benefit reduction, we have student loan repayment, and it will be really interesting to see what the next 2 quarters hold as we head into the back portion of the year. So on that is my overall economic take on that.
Sure, that makes sense. Well, what about the other one that's been a big topic for the last couple of years now has been around shrink and asset protection, those types of topics. Was that something that came up on the calls as well?
Absolutely. It comes up on all the calls. Even when it doesn't come up on a call, it does end up getting asked, which I find very interesting. So yes, there are quite a few things here, but I just have a long list of the top people who called it out. So I'm not going to run through them. That is not an exhaustive list either. There are many, many, many more. But it's really interesting when you look at it compared to where we were a year and a half ago, where we were previously when it comes to this. But we're starting to see some of the actions retailers are taking go into effect in stores. putting things behind glass, more tethering, removing product altogether. It will be interesting to see consumer sentiment, how consumers react to that. I think I've already seen on LinkedIn, on some other social channels, people expressing frustration about not being able to get snacks that are behind glass or razor blades or things like that, because they're not able to find someone to unlock a case. So I think there's a balance we'll have to strike as the retail industry of how do you protect your business from shrink, but also not alienate your customer. So that will be interesting. Dick's talked about it. They mentioned it 39 times, shrink, in their call. And they brought it up in the first 5 minutes of their call as a driver of 30% of their profitability miss was shrink. It's pretty uncommon, especially, if you listen to earnings calls, that the beginning 5 to 10 minutes is high level overview. So for something this specific to get mentioned in that very beginning portion means that they believe there's significant impact there. There are some things where the Inform Act went into effect in the end of June. This is hopefully going to reduce reselling of product, which targets organized retail crime. So hopefully we'll see some difference from that as well. But there's some interesting trends here. So what you see down at the bottom there is a list of the amount of times shrink, organized retail crime, or theft was mentioned in target earnings calls. I had this thought last year that, or earlier this year, that I thought I just started hearing people talk about it middle of last year. And then I was like, maybe I just wasn't paying attention. I don't know. So I went through and did some word count work on their earnings calls. And you can see that I was not wrong. It's really interesting. Between 2018 and the beginning of 2022, it was mentioned 0 times in all those years. And then it goes up just a little, gets mentioned once in Q2, 10 times in Q3, 8 in Q4, 31 in Q1 of this year. 31 times they talked about it. And then 17, a little marginal decline, but 17 times in this quarter. So, and they're not alone. I actually took a quick look at a few other retailers as well. And it looks really similar. So I think this will continue to be a conversation, especially because the reason it comes up, even for retailers that have not had a significant increase in their year-over-year shrink or pre-COVID shrink. Best Buy, for example, did not talk about shrink. One of the analysts asked them. They said their shrink is comparable to what it was in 2019, but what they have seen is an increase in violent incidents. So because of that, I think that's another reason that it's becoming a primary focus. In the recently released National Retail Security Survey that NRF did, it showed that of the retailers they survey that track violent incidents, they saw a 35% increase.
Wow.
So it's really significant. Target actually gave some specifics as well. And in the first half of the year-ish, they saw a 120% increase in events that included violence or threats of violence. So that will continue to be forefront, even if they can mitigate some of the shrink and get it back to normalized levels. If the violent incidents remain, that I think will continue as part of the conversation. So that's my overview for you.
No, thanks. That was great. And I know, just finishing off on shrink, I know we've had a flurry of customers talking to us about it and how they can reduce it and what actions they can take as a result of some of the insights that we can give them. So I know it's a hot topic. And now that the survey's out, maybe next month we spend some time deep diving into what's going on with it. Why is it different? What are some of the key things to really think about and figure out how to kind of reduce it if you're a retailer? So
absolutely. This is a specific special interest of mine, and I read all the things about it. So I know quite a lot, do lots of research on it. And there's so much room for identification and mitigation and doing analysis. It's 65% of shrink comes from theft. There's also 35% that's operational issues and shipment inaccuracy and things like that. And analytics are really helpful in that space.
No, you got it. Wow. Well, fantastic. Thank you again for doing this today. And we'll look forward to digging into that next month then.
Great. Thanks so much, Jeff.
Have a good one, Meg. Bye.